Welcome. I'm Amanda Thomas, and you are listening to A Scientist Walks Into a Bar. This podcast has recordings of talks given at Science on Tap, a series of events held in Portland, Oregon, and Vancouver, Washington. In this episode, we get to hear neuroscientist Dr. Adie Wilson-Poe talk about the role of cannabis in the opioid crisis. She spoke at our event at the Kiggins Theatre in Vancouver in March 2019. You're all aware that there's an opioid epidemic, right? Turns out that a majority of the people addicted to opioids started off using them to manage physical pain. Adie talks about evidence showing that using cannabis alongside or in place of opioids can help manage pain and decrease the amount of opioids needed. There's also evidence that cannabis can keep people from getting addicted to heroin or help them recover from their addiction. Most dramatically, it can also prevent overdose deaths. Take a listen and then find us on Twitter or Facebook at SciBar Podcast and let us know what you think. With that, here we go.
Hi. Thank you so much to the organizers for the invitation to be here. I take the distillation of very complex scientific information in a format that is digestible. That is a moral obligation of mine, so I take this opportunity very seriously. So thank you so much for being here and for your time and attention. So I'm going to talk about cannabis and its role in the opioid crisis. And I am currently a faculty member at Washington University School of Medicine in St. Louis, and I'm just recently starting to make my transition back out here in the Department of Neuroscience at Washington State University. Yay! I should also note, I am an alum of WSU. I did my PhD there with Mike Morgan. So it's really nice to be back. A little weird to walk around the lab and see my, handwriting on certain signs and things. It's like, ooh, man, time warp. But I started there studying the behavioral pharmacology of this drug interaction. So when you put opioids and cannabinoids into an animal, you watch it run around and see what it does. That's called behavioral pharmacology. So I started my path studying this drug interaction when I was just an undergrad, looking at these kinds of models in rodents. I then took a postdoctoral position overseas at the University of Sydney, where I studied the synaptic physiology, so how neurotransmitters in our brains are affected by chronic opioids and cannabinoids, what happens in the brain at the synaptic level. I then came back to the US, first at Columbia University in New York, and most recently again at WashU in St. Louis. The lab that I joined is ironically one of the few labs that studies this dynamic interaction between pain and opioid misuse or abuse, which you would think that those two things go together hand in hand, but it's really actually quite rare for laboratories to study specifically this drug interaction. So previously at all my other places, I had really just studied chronic drug exposure and all the adaptations that happen inside of our brains as a result of lots of drug exposure. But now I've really been focused on the context of pain. So the pain component is really important because these are analgesic drugs. They relieve pain. So of course we need to study pain-relieving drugs in the context of pain. So throughout the talk, I'm going to focus on 4 basic areas where these drugs interact. One of them is how they relieve pain on their own. Also, how cannabis can reduce our reliance on prescription opioids. I'll also talk about what happens after people become physically dependent upon opioids and they begin abusing them, how cannabis fits in there. And finally, how cannabis might fit in the long-term recovery, a lifetime free of opioids. So cannabis has been used medicinally on this planet for more than 5,000 years. We have texts dating back to ancient China showing that cannabis was a part of the pharmacopoeia. It was a normal part of medical practice. I like to say often that phase 1 clinical trials were done 5,000 years ago in China. And a phase 1 clinical trial is where you give cannabis to a whole bunch of healthy people and make sure that it's safe. So we've known for a long time that cannabis is safe. It's been used by the Egyptians, the Greeks and Romans, even through all of the 1800s in the US, cannabis was a part of our pharmacopoeia. You could find all kinds of tinctures and oils and alcohols that contained cannabis in any pharmacy in the country. And it actually wasn't until about 1910 that we have the reverse of what we're seeing right now. So in about 1910, states individually started determining that they were going to outlaw cannabis, and now we have the opposite. States are individually determining that they're going to legalize cannabis. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how cannabis impacts the brain, because it's really important to know a little bit about this system so that you have a better basis for understanding how the opioids come into play. So every one of us is endowed with an endogenous cannabinoid system, or the ECS, the endocannabinoid system. It's present in our bodies just like our hormonal system, just like our immune system. And actually the endocannabinoid system is somewhat of a hybrid between those. It's a hybrid between hormones and immune systems. This system was only recently discovered. We didn't even know that we had it until about the 1990s. And as it turns out, evolution has been using this system for a very long time. Nematodes, fish, reptiles, birds, all mammals have an endogenous cannabinoid system because it is very, very useful for homeostasis, keeping our bodies functioning at normal levels. So I like to think of the endocannabinoid system as setting the volume on brain function, or another way I like to think of it is kind of like a crossing guard. So if we have a bunch of neurotransmitters in our brain that are trying to communicate between neurons, what we see is that the endocannabinoid system somewhat acts like a crossing guard. They're not there to interfere with neurotransmission, they're just making sure that it's functioning properly. So we see that the endocannabinoid system really has a hand in all of our functional processes, so sleep and stress and circadian rhythms and pain. In all of these systems and processes, we found a role for the endogenous cannabinoid system. There's a few key players in this system, one of which is the molecules that our body makes, our own endogenous cannabinoids. These are the versions of, for instance, delta-9 THC is probably the most famous cannabinoid, and these are its cousins. So these guys, they float up and they bind to receptors, and this is the reverse order that neurotransmission usually goes. And then we have these little enzyme guys who break down the endogenous cannabinoids. This is really important. You have to know these players because these are all encoded by genes. We have genes that tell us, how to build these proteins and these molecules. And there are lots of different mutations in all of the genes that make these guys, which partially explains why so many different people have different experiences with cannabis. So I want to talk a little about one particular target in the endocannabinoid system, which is the CB1 receptor. Now I know that you're going to be tempted to think that this is a picture of the Milky Way, and that's because it is. But I bring it up because if we take a look at the expression of the CB1 receptor in the brain, and this is a rat brain, what we see is a strikingly similar pattern. This guy is everywhere. It's on nearly every single neuron. It's in fact very difficult to find neurons or find brain regions where this CB1 receptor is not present. One notable place that it's not present is on all of the machinery that controls our breathing rate, which is why, unlike opioids, where when you have an opioid overdose, your breathing rate is affected, and that's how people die, the same doesn't happen with cannabis. So the CB1 receptor is largely found in the brain, and it largely has to do with brain function, but the CB2 receptor, that's the other main target, that guy's floating around our bloodstream all the time. It's a very, very important protein in our immune system. So there are lots of other targets that could potentially fall under the umbrella of the endocannabinoid system at some point, but it's going to take many, many years of study in order for us to fully characterize all the places that both our endogenous cannabinoids and the exogenous cannabinoids, the ones from outside of the body, it's going to take a while before we fully understand how they're all interacting with our body. So like I mentioned before, every single one of these parts of the endocannabinoid system is encoded by our genes, and therefore we are all endowed with a unique endogenous cannabinoid system. So that's really important going forward because, these days the term personalized medicine is thrown around quite a bit. And for cannabis medicine, this is particularly important because there are just so many places in the endocannabinoid system where we could have differences between people. So if we have profound ability for different people, we need to have the profound ability to treat all those people individually. So we talked about a little bit about the ones inside of our body. Now let's talk a little bit about the ones that come from outside of our body, the endogenous versus the exogenous, or the phytocannabinoids. Phyto meaning plant, plant-derived cannabinoids. So there are essentially two kinds of cannabis plants, right? Indicas and sativas. But I'd like to congratulate you all for being present here today to experience a moment of silence as we mourn the loss of the indica and sativa, because they truly don't exist. In fact, John McPartland, who's a super famous scientist, he's been studying cannabis for 2 or 3 decades, published a paper at the end of 2018, and I quote you from the abstract of the paper: "Ubiquitous interbreeding and hybridization of sativa and indica has rendered their distinctions almost meaningless." Everything is a hybrid. Back in the 1700s, when these plants were discovered on different places on Earth, they very well could have had the potential to produce different kinds of chemistry, which would then produce a different effect in the people consuming those plants. But it's not the 1700s anymore. These things have been interbred in the black market, by the way, where nobody was keeping records. Nobody knows what's really going on or how things have been interbred or hybridized. So it's really important that as consumers and as we come through this period of prohibition being lifted, that we have the education to say, aha, everything's a hybrid. So if everything's a hybrid, and indica and sativa doesn't tell us what to expect in terms of what kinds of effects cannabis can produce, what is predictive of what kinds of effects we'll get from a cannabis plant? What is predictive is pharmacology. Ingredients affect the body and produce a behavior or an effect. And that's what we're really starting to understand with cannabis just very recently, is that all of these molecules are combining with one another, interacting with our unique bodies to produce very variable and wide-ranging effects. So when I see this plant, there's a number of things that you could potentially see, and what I see is hundreds of biologically active molecules. So here we have, 114 distinct kinds of cannabinoids. But in addition to these guys, there are scores of other molecules in there. We've got all the flavonoids, which are like what we see in the skin of grapes. We have esters and alkaloids and aldehydes, and of course the terpenes. Terpenes are the major component of essential oils. Terpenes are present in all kinds of plants. Almost any plant that has any fragrance whatsoever, it smells that way specifically because of these very volatile aromatic molecules. So alpha-pinene is what gives a pine forest, a conifer forest, its very remarkable smell. Linalool is the one that gives lavender its particular smell. One cousin of cannabis, hops, also produces terpenes. So of all of these numerous molecules, most state-regulated markets only test for the presence of 2 of them, our favorites, THC and CBD. And we do know that these guys play a major role in how cannabis affects people for its therapeutic value as well as its mind-altering value. These guys are big players, but they're definitely not the only ones. So we also have right now the capability to convey to consumers much, much more than just THC or CBD. So modern analytical laboratories are looking at a whole host of chemicals, all the minor cannabinoids that might be present in any particular flower of cannabis, also the terpenes that register above the limit of quantitation. And so out there on the internet, you'll find lots of attempts to map all of these cannabinoids with their effects, as well as map all of the terpenes with the effects that they produce. And this is a pretty good effort. However, we've got a long way to go before we can make any accurate claims about what kinds of molecules are producing which effects, which is precisely why I am here, because I am really interested in testing all of these hypotheses. But because we've got hundreds of molecules, scores of molecules all acting at the same time, it's going to be a long time before we can really draw any meaningful conclusions about the constellations of chemistry that produce certain results. So what we can say is about these combinations of chemistry is that in general, when things are consumed together, they produce better effects than they do by themselves. So this is collectively known as the entourage or the ensemble effect. So we know that patients can tolerate whole plant cannabis much, much better than they can tolerate isolated THC on its own. And isolated THC has been an FDA-approved drug for a long time to treat pain and the spasticity from MS. And these patients really find that when they consume whole plant cannabis, they have more symptom relief and less side effects. So there's a number of different ways that all of these molecules could be interacting to produce this entourage or ensemble effect. They're hitting different targets. I sometimes like to refer to whole plant cannabis as the anti-inflammatory multivitamin. There are a number of different pathways which all of these different molecules reduce inflammation and improve pain. And so we have different targets that are producing either additive or synergistic effects. And if you're a pharmacologist, then you know the difference. And if you're not a pharmacologist, it doesn't matter. It just means better. The terpenes could be enhancing the ability of the brain to process and use the drugs. So there's lots of cool ways that a whole plant is probably going to be better than any of these molecules isolated on their own. So pharmacology in general is it's about the characteristics, the effects, and the uses of drugs and their interactions with living organisms. And so it's because of this very diverse plant chemistry that we get lots of diverse kinds of pharmacology, all the different kinds of experiences that people report having with cannabis. And so we've got a very, very genetically diverse plant that is interacting with very genetically diverse people to produce very variable and different effects. So I want to talk a little bit about the administration routes that people consume cannabis with, just because, sort of from a public service standpoint, there's kind of a lack of knowledge about the different ways that cannabis affects people depending on how it's consumed. So inhaled cannabis, whether it's vapor or smoke, the difference being whether it was set on fire or not. Inhaled cannabis, it has a very immediate onset. It takes its effect right away, and it only lasts for 2 to 3 hours. Whereas ingested products, eaten or swallowed products, these tend to take a long time to kick in, but then they last for a very long time. The reason for that is when you eat cannabis, you recruit your liver into the system, and your liver is very good at taking delta-9 THC and metabolizing it into 11-hydroxy-THC. And 11-OH is 20 times more potent than delta-9. So usually when we see reports of somebody's mom not knowing it was a brownie that was a magic brownie, and she goes to the ER because she thinks she's gonna die, even though she's not gonna die, that's because she ate it, and her liver was really good at pumping her bloodstream full of 11-hydroxy-THC. We also have tinctures and topicals, and I like to sort of lump those two in the same category because you're basically applying them to the skin, whether that skin is under your tongue or your actual skin. And this stuff we have very, very little information about because we just haven't done enough studies. A brief note about dosing also. So I'm just going to do some quick math with you. If we have a 20% flower, and this is a very average product in regulated markets, 20% THC is quite common. So if we have a half a gram of that stuff, then essentially we have 100 milligrams of THC in this whole joint. And so when you light the end of the joint on fire, you're essentially, and you take one hit from it, you might get 10 milligrams of THC. Although, depending on how hard you pull and how long you left the lighter up there and what the paper is made out of and how tightly it was rolled and who knows what else, this dose, quote unquote, is going to be highly variable and very difficult to control. From a medical standpoint, uncontrolled dosing is a huge problem, which is precisely why a lot of patients have stopped inhaling via smoke and have started inhaling via vaporization. So because I'm standing in an auditorium where cannabis is legal, a lot of you may be familiar with this device. Can you raise your hand if you're familiar with this device? So this is a handheld portable vaporizer. So this allows a patient to still have the immediate onset of having the cannabis take effect on their body right away, but with the added benefit that they're not actually lighting the product on fire and they're not consuming any carcinogenic materials. So when we consume cannabis, there are lots of different things that could happen, right? We could get an intoxication, we could have seizure relief, we could have less inflammation. The one effect that I'm most interested in is cannabis's ability to produce pain relief, to relieve pain. Cannabis does this in large part because it acts on CB1 receptors in a part of the brain, in your midbrain, called the periaqueductal gray. I know, it's a lot of words. But the PAG is essentially the center of my universe. It is the brain's pain headquarters. So if you shut off pain here with some kind of drug, you shut off pain throughout the entire body. So what's really interesting about cannabis is that it does the exact same thing in the exact same part of the brain as opioids. So opioids also act on receptors in the PAG to turn off pain throughout the body. So chronic pain is a massive problem in this country, and it is a massive contributor to the current opioid overdose epidemic that we're facing in North America. At any one point in time, about 1/3 of the country is experiencing chronic pain. Chronic pain itself costs our country, on average, $100 billion a year, and this is in lost productivity and in disability and in direct healthcare costs. However, despite those facts, there is not a shred of evidence to support the idea that long-term opioid use is actually effective for long-term pain. So if they're not effective and they're super dangerous, why are we still using them? The opioid epidemic itself costs this country $500 billion a year. So that's on top of what chronic pain actually costs us. So not only is this a huge economic issue, it's obviously a huge public health issue. We could stand up here and talk for an hour about all of the statistics of the opioid crisis. 115 plus deaths every day, more deaths than there are from handgun violence and from car accidents. For the first time in history, we're losing more people to drugs than we are from car accidents. Our lifespan in this country is on decline. It's really at the lowest that it's been since World War II. And this epidemic is as bad as the HIV epidemic was at its peak in the 1990s. What's really also disturbing is the pattern of all of the prescribing that went in to feed this crisis. We had a 300% increase in opioid prescriptions since 1991. There are 650,000 new prescriptions every day. I think as of the date of this talk, maybe that might be down a little bit because finally the federal government is saying, okay, we have to stop producing pills, and doctors are getting afraid that they're going to be litigated against. But still, even if the supply goes down and doctors are prescribing fewer pills, you're left with all of these people who had a legitimate injury or a legitimate surgery, and they became physically dependent upon their pain medication after following their doctor's orders. And now they're in this boat where their doctor will no longer write them a prescription, and they go into withdrawal. What do we do for these folks? 80% of new heroin users make a transition directly from a pain-relieving opioid. And that's because heroin is unfortunately cheaper and easier to access. So what do we do? What do we do about this problem? All these people dying, there's clearly, people who are interested in solving this epidemic. So we have things like prescription drug monitoring programs, which evidence has shown they don't work. We also have abuse deterrent formulations. So these are changing the pills so that they can't be snorted or injected. And actually what that does is it makes people just turn to heroin even more quickly. We're also trying to identify patients who might be vulnerable to opioid abuse and not give them opioids at all. But that's a really hard distinction to make. If someone is increasing their dose because their pain isn't treated, how is that any different than increasing your dose and having it get the label of misuse? This is a tricky question. The other thing that we have tried to do is change our prescription practices. And this is kind of where cannabis starts to get introduced. So in 2016, the CDC came forth and said, all right, we've got to do something about this opioid epidemic. And so the first recommendation that the CDC makes is that we stop using opioids for most cases of chronic pain. If you're going to write a prescription for something, it's got to be a prescription for something other than an opioid. The National Academies of Sciences and Engineering and Medicine came forth the next year with an answer to this question. And that answer was cannabis. The National Academies found that after surveying the literature, they looked at 10,000 studies in humans, and they found that indeed, cannabis is safe and effective for the relief of chronic pain in adults. Hallelujah. So what happens when a state legalizes cannabis? In states with medical cannabis, we see a number of really interesting things. First of all, we have a decrease in Medicare prescriptions, both the Medicare spending and the number of prescriptions filled for drugs like analgesics, pain-relieving drugs, as well as other dangerous drugs like benzodiazepines. We also see that there's increased worker productivity, so people call in to work, there are fewer sick days. We also see reduced hospitalizations. So there are, on average, 23% lower ER visits with non-fatal overdoses. But the statistic that has been keeping me awake ever since this paper came out in 2014 is that when a state legalizes cannabis, opioid overdose mortality drops by 25%. The longer a state has had a medical cannabis law, the greater this effect is. So for instance, in California, they've had compassionate use since 1996, and they have the lowest opioid overdose mortality rate in the country. So what is it? What is it about cannabis that is keeping people out of the ER and keeping them alive? Well, let's have a look at sort of the timeline of opioid use. So we have, a legitimate injury or a surgery, that the gold standard of care for that injury or surgery is to write a prescription for an opioid. A lot of the time, people can become physically dependent upon that opioid. Their brain and their body produce tolerance, which requires them to use more and more opioids to get pain relief. And at some point, their brain and their body can't function normally without an opioid on board. That's called physical dependence. Now, after someone has physical dependence, if you remove the opioid from the system, they go through a very painful withdrawal syndrome. This has been described as like the 7th level of hell, the worst kind of suffering a human can go through, the worst flu you've ever had, inability to sleep, utter restlessness, sweating, and lots of other horrible symptoms that can last for weeks and even months. So after someone goes through withdrawal, a lot of times they'll be put on a medication to manage that withdrawal, such as methadone or Suboxone, buprenorphine. And then even when they're on those drugs, they need to be slowly tapered or taken off those drugs over a very long amount of time. And really what this does is it puts people on a lifetime road of recovering from the physical dependence upon opioids. So we're going to talk about how cannabis intervenes at pretty much all of these time points. So the first one of those is what happens when someone's taking opioids and you add cannabis. So for a long time, we've known that these drugs produce acute analgesic synergy. That means that when you put both drugs together in the body at the same time, you don't get 2 + 2 = 4, you get 2 + 2 = 7. Right? So you have an even greater effect than you would have expected simply by adding the effects of each drug together. So we also see a two-way or a bi-directional relationship between the drugs. So that way we see that in people who have used cannabis for a long time, they're more sensitive to opioids and vice versa. And we have seen this in animals for a long time too. There's something really interesting happening in the central nervous system where these two systems are very interdependent and interrelated. What this means is we could potentially take advantage of this enhanced pain relief in order to reduce the dose of opioids that are required in order to produce pain relief. If we can reduce the doses required to produce pain relief, then we can prevent physical dependence and all that nasty stuff that happens after that. So this is all well and good. And if we have synergistic or enhanced pain relief, do we also get enhanced addiction? Because that would kind of be a huge problem, right? We don't want to enhance pain relief and enhance the negative side effects like addiction and dependence. But this turns out not to be the case. And in fact, if you give patients, chronic pain patients who are on opioids, sometimes for decades, if you just give them access to cannabis, then they reduce their opioid consumption by half. And this has been replicated all across the globe from Israel to Ann Arbor. And we see that if you just give someone access to cannabis, no instructions whatsoever from the doctor, they reduce their opioid consumption by half. Nothing else that we have tried, no other law, no other recommendation from the CDC, no other regulatory framework, nothing has been able to impact opioid consumption by 50%. So the question is this just because these are pain patients that they are somehow protected and that pain patients are a special population and that doesn't apply to people using illicit opioids like heroin and fentanyl? No, actually, the same is true. So if we look at, this is work done in Vancouver, BC, and they've shown that for people who are using illicit heroin or street drugs, that if those people are also using cannabis, not even daily users of cannabis, just any cannabis at all, they're 4 times less likely to end up in the ER with a non-fatal overdose. So this is not specific to pain patients. This is not just because someone is having their analgesic requirements met, their pain relieving requirements met. There is something about cannabis that is keeping people alive. So a lot of times we think about, this side of addiction, the chasing the dragon component of opioids. And that's true. These drugs produce euphoria like nothing else on the planet. But the vast majority of people who are using opioids are not doing this. They're trying to escape the suffering that they're experiencing. the suffering that they're experiencing as a result of using the drugs for so long. And some really brilliant work by a researcher, George Koob, he has somewhat hypothesized that when people are using drugs for a long period of time, we all have fluctuations in our mood. Sometimes we feel better than others, and that over time, chronic drug use drives this baseline down. And so no matter how hard we try, we can never quite cycle back up to what a normal mood state might be. So this is really critical because when we're talking a little bit about what cannabis does and how it can potentially intervene in this addiction cycle, this component is going to be really important, this mood component. So when people have a physical dependence upon opioids, there are lots of things that we can do to try and treat the withdrawal that occurs when they go off. We have lots of FDA-approved medications and lots of things to throw at all the really horrible symptoms that people go through when they're going through withdrawal. However, in the second phase, like almost anyone can make it through withdrawal, but almost no one can make it all the way through their life without relapse. So we really, we use some of the same drugs to try and prevent relapse, but that's not what they were designed for. They were designed to help people go through withdrawal. But we have lots of, evidence showing that, social support combined with some of these drugs is pretty good at relapse prevention, but none of these things is really designed to keep people from craving the drugs. So let's talk about those drugs, the medication-assisted therapies. These are the drugs that people are given to help them wean themselves off of their opioids, so methadone and buprenorphine. So how well do these things work? So compared to either abstinence therapy, which almost 100% of people relapse with abstinence alone, even resident programs that are abstinence-based have a relapse rate of at least 80%. And if we give someone either buprenorphine or methadone, so this is the active ingredient in Suboxone, if we give them buprenorphine or methadone, you've got like a 50-50 chance of relapse. That's not very good. So that is how well does it work. Now, what about how well can you get access to it? So if we look at all of the licensed physicians in the United States, 3% of them have the special waiver from the DEA that you need in order to be able to write a prescription for buprenorphine for Suboxone. So we've got all these guys who can make you physically dependent upon an opioid, and only these guys can help you get off of it. And even then, it's often not covered by insurance. And so we have a huge access problem, not to mention that, we only have 1,500 methadone clinics in the entire United States. So you have a 50-50 chance of the drugs working if you can afford them, and if they're in your town, and if there's a doctor who can write you a prescription for them. So there are massive, massive barriers to getting the kind of treatment that might work for you. Not to mention the geographic barriers. So this is a heat map showing basically where the areas of the most opioid overdoses are happening. And unfortunately, this heat map does not correlate well with the areas where methadone assistance or buprenorphine are available. We have huge areas of the country that have absolutely no access to these therapies. So, how does cannabis come in? The infamous gateway drug. The gateway drug, cannabis, is indeed correlated with the use of harder drugs like heroin. But so is alcohol, and so are cigarettes. So correlation, we know, is not the same thing as causation. Just because someone tried cannabis doesn't mean that they became physically dependent on opioids because cannabis changed their brain chemistry permanently. We know that now, after decades of addiction research, that what most heroin users have in common is not that they used cannabis, but they have risk-taking behavior. So if you're willing to take the risk to cut chemistry class in high school, then you're probably willing to take the risk to cut history class. It's about the risk. It's not about the class. So we are starting to understand that cannabis is probably not the gateway drug to opioid use, But is it actually the exit drug from opioid use? Let's dig into that a little bit deeper. So about 15 or 20 years ago, we started getting anecdotal reports from people saying, hey, doc, if I smoke a J before bed, I don't need to take my opioid to fall asleep. And we were getting all these anecdotal reports about people using cannabis for pain. And I was like, yeah. Until it wasn't yeah anymore, because then it became community-defined evidence. And then we had clinical trials, and we have all of this really firm evidence to show that cannabis relieves pain. And the same thing is happening right now with people who are using cannabis to wean themselves off of opioids like heroin. So we have all of these anecdotal reports of people saying, I literally got clean thanks to cannabis. And so we are now seeing some evidence in the literature, both from animals and from people, that cannabis can alleviate the acute withdrawal syndrome, just like methadone and Suboxone. But more importantly, they can prevent drug craving. So this is the key, because none of those other drugs that we have from the FDA prevent someone from craving their drugs. There's a really beautiful study from Yasmin Hurd at Mount Sinai, and she's giving high-dose cannabidiol, CBD, to patients who come into the ER with a non-fatal overdose from heroin. And even one dose of CBD prevents heroin craving for a week. Nothing else does that. So there's a number of efforts, both in private and public sectors, that are a number of people who are taking a look at these kinds of evidence and trying to determine if there is truly a harm reduction role for cannabis in opioid dependence. So we see a number of states who have, medical cannabis programs by state. They have a list of qualifying conditions. So if you have chronic pain, or if you have Crohn's or PTSD, that's a qualifying condition, and a physician can say, yep, you've got this condition, therefore you're certified to participate in the medical cannabis program. So in a number of states, opioid use disorder is a qualifying condition. You can get a cannabis recommendation if you have opioid use disorder. Illinois has gone one step further, and this is precisely the kind of intervention we need with a crisis this big. Illinois, if you are a patient holding a prescription for an analgesic, an opioid analgesic, you automatically qualify for the medical cannabis program in that state. So we have this huge, raging public health problem, and Illinois has really taken a big fat fire hose and pointed it right at the problem, an immediate answer to keep people out of the ER. There are also some private recovery clinics, like addiction recovery clinics, that are beginning to incorporate cannabis as a harm reduction tool, not just to get them through the acute withdrawal, but to keep them on a path of recovery and keep them from relapsing back to opioids. So the argument here is that here you have a lethal drug, and even methadone and Suboxone can be lethal. People do overdose and die from methadone. But cannabis cannot produce a lethal overdose. So this is the whole heart and soul of harm reduction. Here you have a medication that could kill you, and this other one can't, right? So even if you do become physically dependent on cannabis, you have to use it every day, just like some people have to use insulin every day. At least it's not gonna kill you. That's the heart of harm reduction. So, how well does cannabis work as a medication-assisted therapy itself? We don't know. But luckily, there are people who are very interested in answering this question for us, and the Canadians, thankfully, because they have a federal regulatory framework which is supportive of this kind of research, the Canadians are actively conducting clinical trials to look at the role of cannabis as an add-on therapy to methadone to keep people in recovery. So how well does it work? We'll see. And how easy is cannabis to access? Because the other problem with those drugs like methadone and Suboxone was, of course, how hard it is to get your hands on them. And we know that more than 21% of this country right now has access to cannabis. If you live in Oregon, it's a very, very cheap product as well, because we're literally up to our eyeballs with oversupply at the moment. But we know that it is relatively affordable. It has been a folk medicine for thousands of years. You can grow it yourself. which means if you're in a rural community or an underserved community, an impoverished community on a fixed income, there is access to an option for you. So even if it's not that great of an option, even if it doesn't work as well as some other therapies, is at least something, which again is pointing to harm reduction. The other thing about opioid use disorder is that it doesn't happen in isolation. So people who are physically dependent on opioids, a lot of times they got there because they had pain. And we know now that pain actually has two sides. It's two sides to the same coin. It is that physical pain, the bodily sensation of discomfort. But the other side of the coin is the emotional suffering. And these two things are often indistinguishable. In 80% of chronic pain patients, there's a mood disorder like depression or anxiety. And so, of course, if you're only throwing a drug at one half of that equation, you're only going to get, half the results. We have to take a holistic treatment approach. We have to look at all of the kinds of suffering that someone is going through, whether it's social poverty or whether it is, the depression or the anxiety, and that treating these things at the same time is really the key to keeping people on a sustainable and whole life for the rest of their life. So earlier we talked a little bit about, the dark side of addiction and that constantly fluctuating mood that's always drifting downward as a result of opioid exposure. Cannabis obviously is used by most of planet Earth because of its ability to improve mood, produce euphoria, produce a subjective high, a feeling of well-being. And isn't it interesting that it also actually relieves pain? It is an analgesic drug at the neuronal level. So here you have a therapy that not only addresses the physical, somatic sensation of pain, but also can potentially support that emotional component of pain. And if we can't untie those two, then let's use every tool we can to support people in all aspects of their pain. So in this country, we've really had, a couple hundred years of this puritanical view of medicine, which is that, if you're going to be on a pain-relieving drug, let's try and develop a pain-relieving drug that can't be abused. So, in the opioid field, we've been working for a very long time to have a really powerful opioid that has no abuse liability. The animals won't push a button to receive injections of it because it doesn't feel good to them. Isn't the whole point to feel better? You have to feel better to feel better. And so this is kind of, looking into what modern cannabis use might look like. It really does take this emotional component into consideration. Yes, cannabis can be abused. It is a rewarding substance. It acts on the mesolimbic forebrain in this reward circuitry to enhance dopamine, just like a lot of other, abused drugs do. But it doesn't hijack the brain in the way that opioids do. So if we go back to this timeline, we talked a little bit about, what happens to patients if they add cannabis onto their regimen. But we haven't yet talked about the ability of, cannabis to work by itself. What's really interesting is that in the animal literature, we've known for decades that cannabis and cannabinoids relieve pain. But there's not a single study in the human literature that has examined the ability of cannabis by itself to relieve pain. So there's one study that I know of that's a hospital on the East Coast, and the guy was enrolling people in this study to look at, make a direct comparison between treating a rib fracture with either cannabis or opioids. And he couldn't complete the study because no one wanted to sign up for the opioid cohort. So it's still never been published. We still have not characterized the ability to relieve pain by itself, long before any opioids ever even have a chance to make it into the body. That right there is cannabis's biggest potential to have the biggest impact on public health on this planet. its ability to relieve pain on its own and never have the need for a person to ever see an opioid. So, what might cannabis therapy look like? In the future, if we have a surgery or if we have some sort of chronic condition, what might cannabis therapy look like? This is something that we're actively studying, so I've got a collaboration with Philadelphia Hospital to look at this exactly. What's going to be effective for your pain? What kinds of THC and CBD products are going to work for you? What time of day do you take them? How often do you take them? So all of these kinds of questions, again, this is a very new field of medicine that we don't have a lot of understanding about, not only because we just discovered the endogenous cannabinoid system, but also because this whole process has been illegal up until this point, to this very day even. So if we ask patients who, are pain patients and they have access to cannabis, we ask them, when you get access to cannabis, what do you think? How does it affect your opioid consumption? And the vast majority of them are able to decrease their opioid dose. We talked about that before. But they also find the side effects of cannabis to be more tolerable than the side effects of opioids. Isn't that funny? Cannabis is enjoyable. Most patients say they prefer cannabis to opioids, and also the vast majority of patients would say, I would only use cannabis if it was an option to me. So we know that the patients already want this. It's just a matter of time for us to be able to formally do the studies and be able to, create those treatment regimens and to be able to roll out medications that are consistent and reliable for patients. The problem in conducting that kind of research is that cannabis is still a federally illegal substance. The vast majority of biomedical funding in this country comes from the National Institutes of Health, and to date, the National Institute on Drug Abuse is the only funding agency that has been able to deal out any funds for cannabis research. I am very grateful for NIDA because they've paid my paycheck for many years. However, my work has this angle, right? I'm coming in through the back door. I'm trying to understand opioid dangers, and I happen to use cannabis. So of course they're interested in my work because, opioid drug abuse is a huge problem. But wouldn't it be amazing if we had a lot more funding to be able to study the impacts of cannabis on Crohn's disease, on fibromyalgia, on all of these other things? And so when cannabis is no longer a federally controlled substance in the Schedule I category, we'll open up all the doors for us to be able to look at, write a grant about, hey, can cannabis actually treat cancer or make tumors shrink? We can't write a grant like that right now because there's just no funding mechanism for it. If it doesn't have to do with drug abuse, then the NIH can't give us a grant for it. This is only a matter of time. Israel has had federally funded research programs for cannabis for a couple of decades. Canada has had federally funded research for cannabis for a couple of decades. So it's only a matter of time before we get all of the funding we really need to be able to answer all of these extremely burning and important questions. Before I let you go, I want to talk about marijuana. This guy is Henry Anslinger. He was the first drug czar in the United States, and he was pretty much single-handedly responsible for introducing the term marijuana into the North American lexicon. Up until this point, cannabis was on a shelf at pharmacies all across the US. But in the 30s, marijuana was introduced as this crazy drug that turned law-abiding citizens into criminals. And it was done specifically for the reason of disenfranchising and discriminating against people of color. Marijuana does not exist. Cannabis does. Cannabis is an incredibly useful plant that produces a staggering variability of phytochemicals as well as other things like fiber and seeds for food and for animal feed. It's an excellent bioremediator. It pulls heavy metals out of the soil. If we planted it at Chernobyl, we might be able to go there in our lifetime. So before I let you go, I wanted to state the importance of not using the word marijuana ever, because it truly is a fictitious drug. With that, thank you for your time and attention.
Time for Q&As.
Thanks for the talk. It was really informative. A couple of things. You didn't really touch on the side effects or ill effects of cannabis, which maybe there aren't any, but just can you clarify that, please? And also, you talked very early about the genetic variation, which was really interesting because, from my experience, there is quite a bit of variation on how people respond to the same drug. So can you talk a little bit more about that and how that applies to the studies?
So the first question is, I'll phrase it this way: is cannabis safe? Yes, mostly. Are there risks? Yes, absolutely. Are there certain populations of people who shouldn't use cannabis? Absolutely. Those people include adolescents. We have a lot of literature to support that the developing brain and THC do not play well together, and that results in long-term, lifelong changes in behavior and in emotion and in cognitive ability. Lots of bad things happen when people under 21 are exposed to THC, especially chronically. Now, there's a question there about, well, what about kids? What about kids with autism with low doses of THC? What about kids with epilepsy with low doses of THC? If a kid isn't going to make it to college because they're going to die from their disease, then it's, again, a harm reduction strategy of supporting them to be a functional, human. But we know that THC is bad for the developing brain. Also, we know that THC specifically, we don't know this about the other cannabinoids because they just haven't been studied, but we know that THC specifically, with high doses or a lot of consumption of it, there's a bunch of negative things that can happen. One, cannabis use disorders. We know that cannabis is addictive. It can be abused, just like anything else that activates the reward system. Chocolate can be abused, sugar is definitely abused, beer is abused. Anything that activates the reward system can be abused. We know that this is a profound effect of cannabis. What it's about is about being able to moderate in a way that keeps those things in check. So cannabis use disorder is a diagnosable condition. It's in the DSM. And some of the characteristics that people have to exhibit to have cannabis use disorder are they have to have tolerance, physical dependence that's, highlighted by withdrawal syndrome. And the withdrawal syndrome from cannabis feels like a lot of people report that it feels very similar to nicotine withdrawal. So, but it also has to impact a person's well-being in another way, like they have to have economic or social impacts, right? Their family falls apart, or they lose their job, or there has to be some other larger impact. So, but we do know that that is a risk, and that some people are probably more vulnerable to that than other people. There also is a pretty profound ability for cannabinoids to interact with the liver and cause the liver enzymes to change their function. So if you've ever seen a prescription that says, do not consume this with grapefruit, it's because grapefruit interferes with the liver, and cannabis does the same thing. So if you are on any kind of medication, especially ones that are regulating blood pressure or heart rate or things like that, and you add cannabis on top of it, then you could potentially be creating a drug-drug interaction, which would be contraindicated. So there might be some dangers there. We have seen that in children with epilepsy. So if they take high doses of CBD, cannabidiol, which is now FDA approved under the name Epidiolex. So if kids take a lot of Epidiolex, their rates or their blood levels of their other seizure medications go way up, but that means that they can come off those drugs or take much lower doses. Is it a one-size-fits-all, super safe for everybody? Absolutely not. There are risks, but here's our ability to learn from the mistakes of the opioid epidemic. So with the opioids, we rarely told our patients, hey, this stuff might be dangerous, so if you notice that you're escalating your dose, maybe just take like 2 days off and then come back to it. This is exactly the opportunity that we have with cannabis, because people develop tolerance to cannabis, they escalate their dose, and even a 48-hour tolerance break resensitizes the CB1 receptors in the brain so that they can go back to their previous dose and have an efficacious pain-relieving effect. So this is really an opportunity for us to take an approach that is moderate and fully aware of all of those risks. So your other question was genetic variation in humans and how that contributes to people's different effects from cannabis. So I'm not saying anyone in this room has ever had this experience, but it has been reported that if you have a circle of friends and you pass around a joint, that joint is going to affect people differently. Some people are hyper sensitive to THC. Even a tiny bit sends them into a full-blown paranoia and they think they're gonna die. Whereas other people, that same amount, even if they've never had cannabis or they haven't had it in a very long time, it barely affects them. So there are a lot of different genes that could contribute to that variability in the different ways that the same cannabis product or the same dose of cannabis will affect people. So, right now the market is really dominated by very THC heavy products that are mostly being used by people who are very comfortable with a lot of THC, and that's leaving a lot of potential patients on the sidelines with the inability to participate because there are simply not those low potency products which might be a better fit for their own body's metabolism.
Yeah, I was just wondering, has there been any research on using cannabis to wean people off of alcohol if they're alcoholics?
Yes. There's less formal research, a lot of anecdotal and community-defined reports. There was a recent study, so I'll tell you a little bit about this. So alcohol and cannabis are equally impairing, but even in the 80s, we knew that people with alcohol impairment, people who are drunk, are not aware of how many mistakes they make in a driving simulator, whereas people who are high on cannabis, they know that they're high. So we also know that consuming THC will increase the blood levels of alcohol. So when they're introduced in the system together, it will potentiate the intoxication. However, there's a lot of community-defined evidence that people are reporting that if they use cannabis first, they don't have alcohol craving. And we also see this in animals, even with just cannabidiol, just CBD administration, they just won't push a button for ethanol. So there is also something here, again, kind of suggesting that there's this mood component, that if you're already sort of altered and satisfied, there's no need to push the button for something else.
I have a question about particularly the sleep aspect of THC in recovery. I saw in your presentation that it included that use of THC in association with opioids post-surgery leads to better sleep. But I've also seen research that talks about how alcohol and THC use, even 3 or 4 hours before bedtime, will decrease the patient's ability to go into deep sleep, such as REM sleep. And when you're post-operative state, that deep sleep has a lot to do with your muscle recovery and your body healing itself. So I'm curious how you can say THC adds to better sleep when there's data out there stopping a person from going into the deeper levels of sleep required for effective healing.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Thank you for bringing that up. So there's a number of different things to unpack there, one of which is what kind of pain are we talking about? And there are hundreds of different kinds of pain. Post-op pain, post-surgery pain. Those are exactly the kinds of pain that 3 days of opioids are great for. After those first 3 days, what are we talking about? We're talking about people who might be living with pain for 10 and 20 years. And what a lot of those chronic pain patients report is the inability to sleep because they're in pain. You're absolutely right that cannabis does interfere with the amount of REM sleep that a person gets. And even in animals, this is true. There's an association between cannabis use or cannabis exposure and the prolonging of the non-REM phases of sleep. But even for a different set of patients, this is exactly what they need. So one of the things that victims of PTSD report is that with cannabis, they experience fewer nightmares. And the reason that they're able to get better sleep and feel better the next day is because specifically they had less REM sleep because they used cannabis before bed. So this kind of goes back to that personalized approach. What kind of pain are we talking about? What kind of symptom relief are we trying to achieve? What kind of lifestyle improvement are we trying to achieve? Because yes, THC also produces tachycardia, a racing heart. And if you have a racing heart, it can often be very difficult to fall asleep. So there are dose effects, there are, individual person with your genetic effects, there are lots of different components that really require, unfortunately at this moment, a lot of self-experimentation. So patients have to figure out what works for them on their own without any guidance from their doctors, because their doctors, 85% of them at least, got all the way through med school, through their fellowships, through their residencies, and never had one iota of training about the endogenous cannabinoid system or cannabis pharmacology. 85% of doctors have no education whatsoever about cannabis. So it's an excellent question. It's very complicated. Sleep itself is very complicated. Pain itself is very complicated. Cannabis is very complicated. So you have this Venn diagram of complication. So excellent question, and I hope we have more answers someday.
First off, I want to say thank you for being here and thank you for doing the research that you're doing. I think it's really important. Thank you. So you spoke on the endocannabinoid system, and I'm curious, what do we know about our body's ability to naturally produce cannabinoids, and like those that have been found in breast milk? And then also, what do we know about these specific cannabinoids and the effect on the infants? And then my second question is, have you heard of any of the studies regarding cannabinoid deficiency?
Yeah. So the first part of your first question is related to that second question. So let's talk about that first, and then we'll talk about kids. So what we know about the endogenous cannabinoid system is, if at least in animals, if you knock out any part of that endogenous system, the whole organism goes super wonky. On almost everything we try to measure, sleep and stress and pain. And if you mess with the endocannabinoid system, you mess with almost every bodily function. What we know about humans and their ability to produce endocannabinoids, and our understanding of this is relatively sparse, but we've at least put people in brain scanners. And we've seen that with people, for instance, with fibromyalgia, which is an autoimmune disorder, it causes widespread kind of non-specific pain. People with fibromyalgia have been shown to have much, much lower levels of circulating endogenous cannabinoids. So there's this hypothesis right now that many of these autoimmune disorders are actually clinical endocannabinoid deficiency syndrome. So, we talked at the very beginning of the talk about how the endocannabinoid system is kind of this hybrid between hormones and immune systems. And this is a hot topic of research right now, because we're seeing that with a lot of autoimmune disorders, if you support the endogenous cannabinoid system by introducing, plant-derived cannabinoids, rheumatoid arthritis gets better, Crohn's gets better, fibromyalgia gets better. Lots of these autoimmune disorders get better when you support the endocannabinoid system. So again, once we have federal funding to do more research, we'll have a lot more of those answers. Your other question about the endocannabinoids in breast milk and the ability of cannabinoids to get into the breast milk, yes, these are very lipophilic molecules. Cannabis and THC have been found in breast milk of mothers who use cannabis, and those things definitely can get transmitted to the baby. In rat studies, actually here at Washington State, we've seen that prenatal exposure to THC has very bad effects in the offspring. So even prenatal exposure, the cannabinoids will cross the placenta. And if you think about this, this makes sense. If we have an endocannabinoid system that's developing in utero, developing as an infant, and it's so critically involved in all of our normal functions, our normal sleep, our normal pain, our normal stress responses, if you get in there and start tinkering around during critical windows of development, it kind of makes sense that you would see, negative effects when that rat pup or when that, person becomes an adult.
Hi there. So you said at the very beginning that there is no difference between sativa and indica. So I am curious why everyone in the room is laughing, because we all know indica winds you down, makes you hungry. Sativa winds you up and makes you paranoid. What is doing that, and why does everybody here know it?
Your brain is very powerful. Let me start with a really quick anecdote. When I was a first-year postdoc, I attended a lecture in Australia where they treat chronic pain as a disease, not as a symptom. It's its own disease category. And I saw these, behavior guys who are doing cognitive behavioral therapy and meditation and coping strategies. And they had their patients all laid up on the stage, and this guy had a gnarly workplace accident. And they're asking him, what's your pain right now? And he's like, I'm at an 8. He's suffering. He's at an 8 out of 10, and he's just chilling. His ability to use those coping strategies, the cognitive coping strategies, were far more powerful than any pharmaceutical that he had been given, than any steroid he had been given. His ability to have the expectation of being in control of his life and his pain, that's all he needed. If you have an expectation that this indica is going to put you in the couch, that's what you're going to get. The placebo effect, and that your brain's ability to produce that expectation is as equally effective or as equally powerful as the drugs themselves. So I have a side project going on, sort of outside of all of this work, where we're giving cannabis samples to recreational consumers, double-blinded. I don't know what they're getting. They don't know what they're getting. And we're recording, how much elevation or sedation did you experience. Once all of that work is complete, we'll be able to really bust that myth.
I was just wondering what the status of the research is on whether or not cannabis causes schizophrenia in some people.
Yes, so this was another risk factor the gentleman asked about. There is a link between cannabis and psychosis. Maybe not a causal link, but there is something happening there. So in the National Academies report, when they reviewed all those 10,000 studies in people and they came to the conclusion that cannabis is good for chronic pain, they also came to the conclusion that there's something up with psychosis. This, again, we know that the greatest risk comes with the greatest doses. And right now, we're at a period in history where we are seeing the craziest doses that planet Earth has ever seen. So vaporized concentrates or dabbing is really an experimental drug. We have no idea what the long-term effects of that are. And we've seen a dramatic increase in ER visits with young, otherwise healthy males typically, who come into the ER with acute psychosis because they took a dab, because they inhaled this super, super concentrated THC. I mean, if you look at the common sense principle of moderation, yeah, no kidding, you're in the ER. We also know that vaporizing those products can break them down in a manner that they become toxic. So the terpenes that are present in cannabis, if you heat them up high enough, they become toxic products. So yes, there is a link. There could be the ability for cannabis, especially at high doses, to reduce the age at which a person might have experienced a psychotic break anyway. But there's a ton more work that needs to be done to fully characterize what that relationship is.
All right, let's give Dr. Adie Wilson-Poe one more round of applause.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for making it all the way to the end. If you liked what you've heard or if you have any questions for us, please let us know on social media. We are on Facebook and Twitter at SciBar Podcast, and that's SCIBAR Podcast. If you're into that kind of thing, reviewing us on Apple Podcasts would be a big help. If you're around Portland or Vancouver and want to come to an event, our list of upcoming topics is at our website at scienceontap.org, and that last part stands for Oregon and Washington. You can also find out more about the events on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at ScienceOnTapORWA. As always, I'd like to say a big thank you to my friends who volunteer their time to help me with these events. Several of them have been helping me run events since about 2007, and this would not happen without them. They are Scott Fry, Chris Gowan, Sam Lauk, Rita Nygren, Steve Perry, and Chris Trone. I'd also like to say a special thank you to Amber Peoples for hosting this event and to Graham Tully for his excellent audio production. Finally, a big thank you to Jonathan Coulton for letting us use his song Mandelbrot Set as our theme music.
Just in time to save the